Smaller parties have sprung up in various provinces looking to garner enough votes to make their way into legislative bodies in several provinces. Some are leaders who have been part of former President Jacob Zuma's inner circle and among his die-hard supporters. Well, what is their game plan, or what is the end game for them? To help us unpack this issue, I'm joined by Professor Duvenage from the Northwest University. Professor Duvenage, thank you so very much for joining us. Now, what was really interesting, of course, is yesterday the Black First, Land First movement unveiled what they call their battle plan. Other parties call it their manifesto. And what we saw there was a clear endorsement by President Jacob Zuma of this party. We also have a party in the Northwest, we have a party in KwaZulu-Natal, and we have a party in the Free State headed up by Mr. Hlaudi Motsoeneng, and then of course we have Mr. Jimmy Manye with ATM. What do you think these particular smaller parties, what is their relationship with former President Jacob Zuma? Are they coordinated? Do they talk to each other? And do they have a plan to potentially form a coalition after, we see how the vote tallies up after the 8th of May?
Morning, Karima. I must tell you first, the general context is that within our electoral system, it is possible for many parties to compete, and close to 50 parties are going to compete on a national level.
49 to be exact.
Yes,
exactly.
So it's relatively easy to compete. That's the first point. The second point is we are seeing the declining of support by the bigger parties, specifically the ANC, in the last elections, and I'm expecting it also within the context of the DA. The EFF seems to be an exception to this rule. They may increase their support. So the point I like to make is there's going to be more coalition politics in the future. But now the other side of the coin, and that is the huge internal conflict and strife within the ANC.
Exactly.
And the parties you are referring to are basically mobilizing support within the ANC against the Ramaphosa ANC. And here we are talking ATM, we are talking BLF, Mayabuye African Congress, all these smaller parties.
Yes.
And what is clear is they can get support, and in a coalition environment, they may get enough support to just ensure a majority.
Now, what is very interesting, of course, is the strife that we're talking about within the African National Congress. And President Zuma, when Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma didn't win, there was no split from the ANC in the technical terms as there was in Polokwane when COPE was formed. But we have these regional parties that have been formed with the kind of almost tacit blessing of some of the regional strongmen, some of the so-called Premier League characters, someone like Suprama Humapelo backing the party in the Northwest, and of course in KwaZulu-Natal, President Jacob Zuma supposedly campaigning for the African National Congress, but his name is being dropped, being used by all of these parties. What do you think of the strategy of the Zuma faction to do these provincial parties instead of formally splitting from the African National Congress and forming a new organization the way people like Musiwe Lekota and others have done?
Yes, I think they have a two-way strategy, the Zuma group. Their main strategy is to get rid of Mr. Ramaphosa and try to take over the ANC from within. And a part of the strategy is the putting of people on the lists that are Zuma supporters. And my information is that 65% plus of the people on the list is Zuma loyalists. So there's a strong possibility that they may oppose Ramaphosa when he may be elected as president for the 6th Parliament. So they are busy with that strategy. There's the possibility of the National General Council meetings, opposition within the NEC. That's the A plan. But if this is not working, and there's the possibility that Ramaphosa can keep power, they want all these smaller parties in place in order to disrupt him as far as possible, and secondly, to ensure their own positions politically, because they are fighting a battle for survival.
Yes.
And that is where the smaller parties are coming in. And when there's the opportunity for, let's say, coalition politics, they can use their power to the advantage of the leaders.
Okay, let's focus on the Northwest using that scenario. In the Northwest, the ANC structures are dead. A lot of them have been collapsed, and of course, a lot of them are still loyal to, Supra Mahumapelo. So the ANC is very vulnerable in the Northwest. The EFF looks to be improving in the Northwest. And of course, with these smaller parties, you could have a situation where the ANC doesn't have an outright majority and it will need to then negotiate with these people. Two things will happen in my view. One, they get back into the state and they get to the patronage system that exists in the state. And two, they are then able, like you say, to either disrupt ANC governance or to direct it or to demand or to, in fact, even blackmail the provincial executive in that province to adopt certain policies, to give certain tenders to certain companies. I mean, we've already seen that in coalition politics between the DA and the EFF in places like Tshwane.
I have no doubt that there's strong attempts in creating two centers of power. If you cannot control the basic center of politics, like Mr. Supra Mahumapelo cannot do at the moment, then he will create alternatives. And you are quite right, he will use all that systems of state capture to empower himself. But briefly about Northwest, there's not a lot going on within the structures of the ANC. And the election campaign is not very strong, and the people I am talking to is very much concerned about the support base of the ANC. At the same time, there's a lot of momentum going for the EFF, and I think some smaller parties like the Freedom Front Plus and many others are also gaining momentum. So there is the possibility that we may end up in a form of coalition. The same is applicable to some other provinces, Northern Cape, maybe the Western Cape, and in some way Gauteng province. So there is the possibility. What we are looking at is the positioning of political forces to exercise influence in terms of a certain group, elite, or maybe an individual.
Now, Gauteng has been, identified as the province that is the most important to hold on to for the African National Congress. A lot of opposition parties have released internal polls, obviously, that will show they are doing well and that the ANC might, go below 15%. But polling has often been out in South African politics. But we do know that the three metros that the ANC lost, two of whom are in Gauteng, is of course a critical indicator, even though there are differences between municipal elections and national elections. From your calculations, Professor, how at risk is the African National Congress in Gauteng itself? And more importantly, who is likely to be their coalition partner if they need to do so? Will they team up with the EFF or with the DA, considering that from a policy perspective, the ANC actually has more in common with the DA than it has with the EFF?
That's a very difficult and interesting question. I'm working with the figures of the Institute of Race Relations, arguing that the ANC need about 57% support on a national level in order to win Gauteng on a provincial level. And at the moment, the support base of the ANC is fluctuating between, I think it is 54 and about 57. 58.
Is this nationally?
Nationally.
Okay.
So it's a very close margin.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that Gauteng is in trouble. Now, my understanding at this point is that the ANC is not so much negotiating with the DA. They are rather working towards the EFF. But I do not think the Ramaphosa policy framework is aligned with the policies of the EFF. So it's a conflict on certain levels. The problem on the other side is that the Zuma alliance is again working with the EFF as well.
Yes.
So it's a very difficult position where Mr. Ramaphosa is in at the moment. I think the best case scenario is a moderate ANC aligning with the Democratic Alliance, keeping the middle ground together. But we are in a phase of radical populist politics.
Yes.
And we have seen DA, EFF not working well on local level in certain areas. So anything of the two scenarios is possible. But at this point, it seems to me as if coalition between the ANC and the EFF seems to be more likely, dependent on what will happen with the smaller parties. They may bring other options to the table.
One of the things that is interesting for me is, of course, the policy alignment or disalignment of people. We know that coalition parties aren't built, or coalition governments aren't built on policy issues. They are built on convenience. They are expedient arrangements. The African National Congress under Cyril Ramaphosa is determined to clean up the state. It is determined to clean up the remnants of state capture. We see its Secretary General, the newspapers are reporting he's on his own, for example. The EFF, on the other hand, has come to the aid of people like Tom Moyani and others. Cyril Ramaphosa has been the one president who said, I'm putting South Africa first. If he says that, can he go into a coalition with the EFF that wants to provide cover for certain people who are corrupt? And of course, the EFF and the VBS scandal is just becoming tighter and tighter. And of course, we are going to be seeing arrests quite soon in the VBS matter if the Hawks and the NPA is to be believed. So what will go down better with the electorate for the African National Congress? People going to jail for corruption, or aligning with the EFF?
Well, I think, again, it's a difficult question. To start with, I have seen some surveys indicating that the electorate, especially the black electorate, would rather go for a coalition or combination between the ANC and the EFF rather than between the DA and the EFF. My take on the situation at this point is that Ramaphosa is running into serious trouble. And he needs to balance between normative things, his new dawn, getting people in jail, getting South Africa clean up of corruption. But to the other side, there's the strategic considerations. Can he move on people like Ace Magashule? What will happen in the Free State and maybe in KZN? He needs to balance strategic considerations versus normative ones. And I think at this point, he will rather go strategically. I do not expect huge steps before the election. He needs to keep unity within the ANC. But after the elections, we may see a number of other things. Maybe he can work on an individual just as a symbol, but he will be very cautious to go that way.
If you, as a final question, Professor Duvenage, the issues around Ace Magashule is beginning to really circle around his ankles. We had Mr. Mxolisi Dukwana coming to the commission, and of course, speaking of an insider, today we see one of Ace Magashule's confidants being released from hospital, and the diagnosis was poisoning. We see other people who have died. This is a big, strong man that has ruled the Free State for 20 years. Is Ramaphosa politically strong enough to come for him? And are the opponents in the Free State who have historically opposed him going to aid Mr. Ramaphosa politically? Because Paul Mashatile, the ANC Treasurer General, is today quoted as saying, Mr. Magashule must go before the Integrity Committee on this matter. Now, that's another top 6 leader giving direction on the matter of Mr. Magashule. Do you think the tide is turning against him?
I think the tide is turning against him. For the first time, I have seen Mr. Magashule in trouble. And you can see it on his face as well, that he knows he's in danger now. He survived a lot of things over the past 20 years. But it seems as if there's a grouping working against him, very strong within the NEC and within the National Working Committee, probably a majority. But again, the risk is if you work on him, you may lose support within the NEC. And we are in an election time. and therefore it's going to be a very tough decision for Mr. Ramaphosa. Must he go for Mr. Magashule, or should he leave him until after the election? And after the election, there's a lot of risk. This is a 50-50 choice.
Absolutely, and of course he has to make his indications clear, because of course the electorate needs to believe that he is going to do that cleanup. Professor Duvenage, thank you so very much for joining us here on The Fix and breaking a very complicated political situation down for us. Up ahead in the program still, your weekend newspapers straight after the break.